Thank you, Madam Chair. With the shutdowns that have already transpired, it's not difficult for any bad actors out there who want to find out who works in these agencies to actually go out and find out who works in these agencies. There's a lot of different avenues to be able to ascertain that information. So all you got to do is go in and find out that information and then cross-reference it with the general data breaches that have already happened, and you're going to be able to create the same kind of list that everyone's worried about avoiding here. To have the credit bureaus be able to generate their own listing to be able to use that in order to mitigate the impacts of a shutdown, it just makes sense. You know, when the shutdown happened, you had people who couldn't pay for their cars, who couldn't pay for their homes, who couldn't pay for their credit cards. And if you're lucky, you're able to get a modification from your lender. But if you weren't lucky, then you were just, you know, in a very, very bad place. And the whole intent of this bill is to make sure that the politics out here in Washington doesn't get into the houses of the people that we're supposed to be serving. It doesn't get into the cars of the people that we're supposed to be serving. It doesn't ruin the credit reports of the families who are some of them putting their lives on the line for this country, and all of them working very, very hard as civil servants. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we really talking about a risk that isn't already out there that we're just trying to flag? Or are we going, and as a result of that, are we seriously going to continue to put these families and these households at a very real, tangible risk? You know, these impacts of these shutdowns aren't based on the potential of somebody getting a hold of something and causing harm. It's actual, tangible harm. And are we going to ignore tangible harm because of the potential for harm? And so I really think that a bill like this makes sense if there's any kind of amendment to consider to perhaps tighten up the privacy constraints, and that's something that we definitely should, you know, put on the table and discuss. But for us to reject HR 4328 and continue to allow all of these workers who were impacted by the shutdown to have their credit on the line as a result of politics out here in Washington, D.C., I think is the most irresponsible action we can take at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair. I first want to echo your sentiments and the sentiments of my colleague from Iowa. I think the opt-out option is definitely something worth discussing. I think it's an example of how we can have healthy bipartisan dialogue to really craft a good bill. With respect to this amendment in the nature of a substitute, it's incredibly different from the actual original legislation that we're considering. On multiple occasions throughout the bill, it talks about guidance. On page 1, line 10, guidance. On page 2, line 20, guidance. On page 3, line 3, guidance. On page 3, line 8, guidance. It's a bill about guidance. It's a bill about having the regulators give guidance to the financial institutions on how to go about evaluating the new risks that might present themselves in the face of a shutdown. First of all, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that giving, you know, mandating that they be given that guidance, I guess, wouldn't be a bad thing in any respects. But I would argue that, you know, all these financial institutions should already know that. If they need that guidance, then there's an actual fundamental problem with the financial institution. The substantive difference between the substitute legislation is that while this is a bill about guiding financial institutions, the original legislation is a bill about protecting the actual employees who are impacted. And on page 3, the entire section 3, starting on line 6 and ending on line 16, specifically says that there's an exclusion for employees affected by a shutdown. That's the material difference between these two pieces of legislation that we're considering. One gives guidance for how financial institutions may handle an individual or a company that's affected by the shutdown. The other is a very clear mandate that there's an exclusion for those who are affected by a shutdown. And I think that that's really the line in the sand that we need to ask ourselves. Are we going to, I think, do what our duty should be and make sure that there is no adverse impact to credit reports for those who are affected by a shutdown? I think that's something that's, you know, we're duty bound to address, versus, you know, to say that, you know, that there should be a guidance regime and kind of let it float that way. But as you mentioned, Madam Chair, in your comments, these two bills are, I would say, two halves of a whole. Let's make sure that we exclude it from the credit reports, and let's make sure the financial institutions are guided by the proper way of going about addressing the way a shutdown might be impacting consumers and impacting companies. And at the end of the day, I think that if we come to terms on including an opt-out provision in the original legislation, that's something that I'm excited to move forward, Madam Chair, and so I'm looking forward to it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much.